Hey guys, tonight we step back 250 years to a world where your smartphone doesn't exist, your toilet is a wooden bucket, and your life expectancy hovers somewhere around 35 if you're lucky. You're about to spend a full day and night in 1776 America, and I'm going to be honest with you, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. The blisters alone would send you crying back to the 21st century, but that's exactly why we're here, isn't it? To appreciate just how soft our modern lives have become while drifting off to sleep in our climate-controlled bedrooms with memory foam mattresses. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this little community stretches across time zones, all of us winding down together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and for a moment you're confused. The darkness surrounding you isn't the familiar glow of a phone screen or the soft hum of a refrigerator in another room. This darkness is absolute, thick, almost textured. You can feel it pressing against your face like a wool blanket. Somewhere nearby, you hear breathing, multiple people actually, and the rustle of straw beneath shifting bodies. A rooster hasn't crowed yet, but your internal clock, trained by months and years of this routine, tells you it's time, somewhere around 4 in the morning, maybe 4:30. The concept of exact time is fuzzy anyway, since the clock on the mantel, if your family even owns one, is more decorative than accurate. You're lying on what passes for a bed in colonial America, which is to say a wooden frame strung with ropes and topped with a mattress stuffed with straw, corn husks, or if you're slightly more fortunate, feathers. The ropes sag in the middle, which is where the phrase sleep tight actually comes from. You need to tighten those ropes periodically, or you'll sink into a hammock-shaped depression that does terrible things to your back. The mattress beneath you crinkles and pokes. Something small is definitely moving in there, and you've learned not to think too hard about what. Bedbugs are so common that people simply accept them as nighttime companions. Fleas hop freely between you, your siblings, and the family dog who's curled up at the foot of the bed for warmth. Because here's the thing about 1776. You don't sleep alone. Privacy is a luxury that hasn't been invented yet, at least not for ordinary people. You share this bed with 2, maybe 3 siblings. Your parents sleep in another bed across the room, or perhaps in the same bed if the house is small enough. Historians still argue whether this sleeping arrangement was purely practical, or carried deeper social significance about family bonds and community. What we know for certain is that personal space, as you understand it, simply doesn't exist. You've never had your own room. You've probably never even slept alone in a bed. The warmth of other bodies is essential for surviving winter nights in a house where the fire dies down to embers by midnight. Speaking of cold, you can see your breath. Even in summer, these early morning hours carry a chill, but right now it's November. The same November when General Washington is trying to hold together a ragged army, while you're just trying to survive another day of ordinary colonial existence. The single window in your room, if there is one, is covered with oiled paper rather than glass. Glass windows exist, certainly, but they're expensive, taxed, and reserved for wealthier households. The oiled paper lets in a murky grey light during the day, but does absolutely nothing to keep out the cold. Your breath hangs in the air as you push back the rough woolen blanket and swing your legs over the side of the bed. Your feet touch the floor and you immediately regret being born. The wooden planks are ice cold, sometimes literally if frost has crept inside. You fumble in the darkness for your shoes, which are stiff leather things that have moulded vaguely to your feet over years of wear. Shoe sizing doesn't exist in any standardized way. You either make your own shoes, inherit them from a deceased relative, or purchase them from a cobbler who eyeballs your foot and does his best. Left and right shoes are identical. The concept of shaped footwear for each foot is something future generations will enjoy. Your shoes are uncomfortable on the best of days, and today, like every day, you'll be standing in them for 16 hours or more. You rise carefully, trying not to wake the others, though in a one-room house, this is nearly impossible. Someone grunts. A baby fusses in a cradle near the hearth. The fire has indeed died down to glowing embers, and your first task, before anything else, before relieving yourself, before eating, before prayer, is to coax that fire back to life. Fire is everything in 1776. It's your heat, your light, your cooking method, and your protection against the genuine terrors of darkness. Letting the fire go completely out is a minor catastrophe, because relighting it means using a flint and steel, a process that can take frustrating minutes of striking sparks onto charcloth and gently blowing tiny embers into flame. So you kneel before the hearth, your knees pressing into the hard-packed dirt floor. Yes, dirt, because wooden floors are another upgrade many families can't afford, and you carefully add kindling to the embers. The smoke rises, and some of it goes up the chimney, some of it does not. Colonial chimneys are inefficient by design, and a permanent haze of wood smoke hangs in the air of every home. Your eyes are used to the sting. Your lungs are coated with a lifetime of inhaled particles. Historians estimate that indoor air quality in an 18th century home was comparable to standing directly over a campfire. You don't know this, of course. You just know that your chest sometimes rattles when you breathe, and that your grandmother's cough never really went away. The fire begins to catch, and flickering orange light pushes back the darkness just enough for you to navigate. Now comes the moment you've been dreading, though you don't consciously dread it anymore because it's simply part of existence. The chamber pot. Tucked beneath the bed or sitting in a corner is a ceramic or metal container that serves as your toilet. You use it now, crouching in the semi-darkness while your family members pretend to sleep, or genuinely sleep through the sounds they've heard thousands of times before. There's no toilet paper, obviously. You use scraps of fabric, corn cobs, leaves, or pages torn from old almanacs. The latter being a surprisingly common choice because the paper is soft and plentiful. The wealthy might use actual toilet paper or wool, but you are not wealthy. The chamber pot will sit there, accumulating contributions from the entire family until someone carries it outside to dump in the privy, the garden, or simply out the back door onto the street. The smell is exactly what you're imagining. But here's the remarkable thing about human adaptation. You barely notice it anymore. Your nose has surrendered. The baseline stench of 1776 is so pervasive that your brain has simply stopped registering it as unusual. Visitors from our time would gag and retch. You just live in it, the way fish don't notice water. A strange glow begins to creep through the oiled paper window. Dawn is coming, though you won't see the actual sun for another hour. You've been awake for 30 minutes already, and the real work of the day hasn't even begun. Outside, you can hear a neighbour's rooster finally deciding to acknowledge what your body already knew. Dogs bark in the distance. Somewhere, a cow lows impatiently, her udders swollen and aching for the morning milking. The village, or the isolated farmstead, depending on where this particular version of your 1776 life is located, is waking up. Smoke begins to rise from other chimneys. The smell of burning wood mingles with the smell of animal manure from the barn, which might be attached to your house or just steps away from your door. You pull on more clothes over the undergarments you slept in, more on that nightmare later, and you prepare yourself for a day that will last until well after dark. A day of physical labour so constant and demanding that modern fitness enthusiasts would weep. A day without running water, refrigeration, antibiotics, or any of the 1,000 invisible conveniences that make 21st century life bearable. But also a day filled with small moments of connection, of community, of purpose that we've perhaps lost in our fragmented digital age. Life in 1776 is brutal, short and uncomfortable, but it's also undeniably human in ways that might surprise you. The fire is burning steadily now. The room is warming, slowly. Your stomach growls, reminding you that you haven't eaten since yesterday's thin supper. Breakfast awaits, though the word breakfast suggests something far more appealing than the reality you're about to face. Your body aches this morning, but that's not unusual. Your body aches every morning. It has ached for as long as you can remember, a low-grade symphony of pains that you've simply accepted as the background music of existence, that twinge in your lower back from bending over crops. Normal, the dull throb in your knees from kneeling on hard surfaces. Expected. The persistent ache in your teeth that flares up when you eat anything too hot, too cold, or too sweet. Just part of being alive in 1776. Let's talk about those teeth, actually, because dental health in colonial America is a horror show that would make any modern dentist collapse in despair. You've probably lost several teeth already, even if you're only in your 20s. The average adult in the 18th century is missing multiple teeth by age 30, and by 50, if you make it that far, you're likely down to scattered survivors clinging to inflamed gums. There's no fluoride in your water. There's no toothpaste as you understand it. You might scrub your teeth with a rag dipped in salt or chew on a frayed twig to clean between them, but these efforts are largely symbolic against the onslaught of sugar, acid, and bacteria. And here's where it gets really fun. When a tooth becomes unbearably painful, your options are limited and uniformly terrible. You can visit a barber, who doubles as a surgeon and tooth puller, and have him yank the offending tooth with metal forceps while you grip the arms of a chair and try not to scream. There's no anaesthesia beyond perhaps a few swigs of whiskey. No antibiotics to prevent the infection that frequently follows. People die from dental abscesses. The infection spreads to the jaw, the blood, the brain with alarming regularity. Even George Washington, the wealthiest and most powerful man in the colonies, suffers constantly from dental problems. His famous wooden teeth aren't actually wooden, by the way. They're made from hippopotamus ivory, human teeth, and metal springs. But the myth persists because the reality is somehow even stranger than fiction. Beyond your teeth, your body carries the accumulated damage of a life without modern medicine. That cough you developed last winter never quite went away. The cut on your hand from the scythe healed, but it healed crooked, and now your grip isn't quite right. Your vision is blurry in one eye, and there's nothing to be done about it except squint. Glasses exist, but they're expensive, crudely made, and not calibrated to your specific vision needs. You've simply adapted to seeing the world slightly out of focus. If you're a woman, your body has been through even more. Multiple pregnancies, likely starting in your late teens, have reshaped your pelvis and weakened your pelvic floor. Complications from childbirth, tears, infections, prolapses, are common and rarely treated effectively. Many women carry permanent injuries from deliveries that would be routine emergencies in a modern hospital, but in 1771 are simply endured and survived. Or not survived. Historians still argue whether colonial women experienced menopause earlier due to the physical stress of their lives, or whether our modern records simply don't capture their experiences accurately. What we know is that pregnancy is dangerous, childbirth is dangerous, and the period between births is consumed with recovering enough to do it all again. For both men and women, chronic pain is managed through methods that range from ineffective to actively harmful. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, is available and widely used, but it's addictive and imprecise. You might take a few drops for a headache or a few spoonfuls for serious pain, but the dosing is guesswork and overdoses happen. Other remedies include mercury, which doctors prescribe for everything from syphilis to constipation. Mercury treatments make your teeth fall out, your gums recede, and your body slowly accumulate heavy metal poisoning. But in 1776, nobody knows this. Mercury is medicine. It makes you salivate profusely, which doctors interpret as the body purging bad humours. The patient is suffering, so clearly the treatment is working. Bloodletting is another popular cure. Feeling feverish? Let's open a vein and drain some blood. Feeling weak? More bloodletting. The logic, based on ancient Greek ideas about bodily humours, is that illness results from imbalances in blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Remove some blood, restore the balance, cure the patient. It doesn't work, of course, and in many cases it actively hastens death by weakening patients who are already fighting infection. George Washington himself will eventually die following aggressive bloodletting for a throat infection. Doctors will drain nearly half his blood supply trying to save him, but that's still decades away, and right now, bloodletting is simply standard practice. Leeches offer a more targeted approach to the same misguided theory. A physician might apply leeches to a swollen joint, an infected wound, or even around the eyes for headaches. The leeches attach, drink their fill, and fall off bloated. The patient feels like something has been done, which provides psychological comfort if nothing else. Some historians argue that leeches provided marginal benefits in certain cases by reducing swelling and improving local circulation, but this is debated. You probably haven't seen a physician anyway. Doctors are expensive, rare outside of cities, and not necessarily more effective than folk remedies passed down through your family. Your mother knows that willow bark tea eases pain. She doesn't know it contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, but she knows it works. She knows that honey helps wounds heal and that garlic seems to fight infection. These folk remedies, dismissed by educated physicians as superstition, often contain genuine medical wisdom that science won't validate for another century or two. When you do get sick, really sick, the primary treatment is prayer and patience. You take to your bed, the same bed you share with siblings who will certainly catch whatever you have, and you wait. Your family brings you broth if they can spare it. Someone might sit with you through the night, keeping vigil, watching for signs of improvement or decline. If you're in a community with a minister, he might visit to pray with you and prepare your soul for whatever outcome God has planned. Death is so common, so woven into daily experience, that this spiritual preparation isn't morbid. It's practical. You've watched siblings die. You've watched neighbours die. Everyone you know has watched someone die. Probably in that same bed. Probably from something that a simple course of antibiotics would cure in our time. But let's assume you survive. Let's assume your current collection of aches and pains remains in the manageable category, the kind of discomfort you can work through. You've risen from your straw mattress, relieved yourself in the chamber pot and coaxed the fire back to life. The morning light is growing stronger, filtering grey and cold through the oiled paper window. Your stomach cramps with hunger, and your body, despite its many complaints, is ready to fuel itself for the labour ahead. You move toward the hearth, where yesterday's leftovers sit in an iron pot, waiting to become today's breakfast. But first, a moment of stillness. Your family is waking now, coughing, stretching, murmuring the half-words of people not yet fully conscious. The baby has started crying in earnest, and your mother or older sister moves to nurse or soothe it. Your father stands, his joints popping audibly, and scratches at the stubble on his face. Another day in 1776 has begun, and whether your body is ready or not, it's time to move. The fire crackles, smoke swirls. Outside, the rooster continues his unnecessary announcements to a world already awake. You take a breath of air that tastes of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the indefinable mustiness of a colonial home, and you prepare yourself for whatever sustenance the morning will provide. It won't be much, but it will be enough. It has to be enough. The iron pot hanging over the fire contains something that might generously be called porridge. It's a thick, greyish mass of cornmeal that was cooked yesterday, allowed to cool overnight, and now sits in congealed lumps waiting to be reheated. You ladle some into a wooden bowl. Ceramic is for families with more money, and you're not one of them. And you carry it to the rough-hewn table that dominates the centre of the room. Steam rises lazily as the fire's heat penetrates the cold mush. You don't have a spoon. Well, you have a spoon somewhere, a carved wooden thing that someone in your family made years ago. But there aren't enough spoons for everyone, so you'll use your fingers and the edge of the bowl. This is breakfast in 1776, and if you're expecting maple syrup, fresh butter and a sprinkle of cinnamon, you should probably wake up and remember where you are. The porridge is bland. It might be seasoned with a bit of salt if salt is available, which it often isn't because salt is imported and taxed and expensive. There might be a splash of molasses if your family has been fortunate in their trading, but molasses is also a luxury that most households ration carefully. You eat the porridge plain, and you're grateful for it because the alternative is not eating at all. Here's something that might surprise you about colonial breakfast. Beer is often on the menu. Not the craft IPA you're imagining, but small beer, a low-alcohol brew that's safer to drink than water in many areas. Water sources in 1796 are frequently contaminated with human and animal waste, and while people don't understand germ theory, they've noticed through painful experience that drinking beer tends to make fewer people sick than drinking water. The brewing process kills many pathogens, and the alcohol provides an additional layer of protection. So you might wash down your cold corn mush with a mug of weak, slightly sour beer, and nobody thinks twice about it. Children drink small beer. Pregnant women drink small beer. It's not about getting drunk, it's about staying alive. Coffee exists in 1776 but remains largely a drink of the wealthy and the urban. It's imported from the Caribbean and arrives in whole bean form that must be roasted and ground at home. The process is laborious, the cost is high, and most rural families simply don't bother. Tea was more common until recently, but tea carries political weight now. The Sons of Liberty have made tea drinking suspect, a sign of loyalist sympathies, and many patriotic households have publicly abandoned it even if they secretly miss the familiar comfort. You drink cider, hard cider, fermented and alcoholic, or beer or water that's been boiled and deemed probably safe. The romantic image of colonial Americans sipping coffee while reading newspapers about revolution is accurate only for a tiny urban elite. Your breakfast might include bread if someone had time to bake it recently. Bread baking is an enormous undertaking that requires maintaining a sourdough starter, mixing and kneading dough, and heating a brick oven to the appropriate temperature, a process that consumes hours and significant firewood. Many families bake only once a week, making large batches of heavy, dense loaves that grow progressively staler and harder to chew as the days pass. By day 6 or 7, you're essentially eating edible bricks that must be soaked in broth or beer before your teeth can penetrate them. Historians still argue whether early American bread was truly as dense and flavourless as accounts suggest, or whether colonial palates had adapted to appreciate textures and tastes that we would find unacceptable. If you're eating breakfast in summer or early fall, you might have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, though the variety is limited compared to the cornucopia of modern grocery stores. Apples are common in New England, peaches appear in the middle colonies. Berries can be foraged if you have time and know where to look. But in November 1776, and remember, we're placing you in this specific revolutionary moment, the growing season is over. You're eating preserved food, dried beans, pickled vegetables, smoked meats if you have them, and endless variations of corn that has been dried, ground, boiled, and served in forms that all taste remarkably similar. Meat is not a breakfast food for ordinary people. Meat is precious, requiring the investment of raising an animal to slaughter size, the labour of butchering, and the skill of preserving what can't be eaten immediately. A chicken that lays eggs is more valuable alive than dead. A pig is a significant capital investment that most families slaughter only once a year, in late autumn when cold weather helps preserve the meat. Beef is even rarer. Cattle are work animals, too valuable for their labour to be eaten casually. When your family does eat meat, it's likely to be at the midday meal, the largest and most important meal of the day, not squandered on breaking your fast. So you sit at the rough table, wooden bowl in hand, and you eat your cold porridge that's slowly warming to lukewarm. Your father eats beside you, silent and focused, fueling himself for the work ahead. Your mother is already up and moving, nursing the baby while somehow also tending the fire, and beginning to organise the day's tasks. Your siblings, however many have survived to their current ages, eat quickly or wait their turn for the porridge pot. Conversation is minimal. Morning is not a social hour. Morning is preparation for survival. One thing that might strike you about this meal is the lack of fresh dairy. You probably imagine colonial farms overflowing with fresh milk, butter and cheese, and while these foods exist, they're more complicated than they appear. Milk spoils rapidly without refrigeration, and cows produce significantly less milk in winter when fresh grass isn't available. The milk that is available often goes into butter or cheese, which preserve better and can be sold or traded. Drinking a glass of fresh milk is rare enough to be memorable, and that glass would be, well, actually a cup or a mug, because glass is expensive and breakable, and generally reserved for other purposes. You scrape the last of the porridge from your bowl with your fingers and lick them clean. Nothing is wasted in 1796. Food is too precious, too hard won. The bowl goes back to be rinsed and used again at midday. Your stomach is not full, but it's satisfied enough to stop complaining. The calories you've consumed will need to carry you through hours of physical labour before you eat again. Your body has learned to run on less, to stretch resources, to make do. Modern researchers estimate that colonial Americans consumed between 2,000 and 3,000 calories per day, depending on season and circumstance, comparable to modern intake, but burned far more efficiently through constant movement and manual labour. The fire needs more wood, the chamber pot needs emptying, the animals outside need feeding, 100 tasks await, and the pale morning light is growing stronger, pressing its quiet urgency against the oiled paper window. You've broken your fast, such as it was. Now the real work begins. Your fingers are still slightly sticky from the porridge, and you wipe them absently on your clothes as you stand. No one notices. No one cares. Cleanliness, like privacy, is a concept that 1776 understands differently than you do. Outside, the rooster has finally stopped crowing. The world smells of smoke, manure, and the sharp, clean scent of approaching winter. You take a breath, and you begin. Getting dressed in 1776 is not the quick affair you're accustomed to. You don't reach into a drawer, grab a t-shirt and jeans, and emerge ready for the world in 90 seconds. Instead, You engage in a layered, complicated process that involves garments whose names you've never heard and whose functions seem designed by someone who genuinely hated the human body. Welcome to colonial fashion, where nothing zips, very little buttons, and everything itches. Let's start with what you're already wearing, because you slept in it. You didn't strip down to skin last night. That would be cold, impractical, and frankly scandalous. You're wearing a shift if you're a woman, which is a long loose linen garment that falls somewhere between a nightgown and an underdress. You've worn this shift for days, possibly weeks. You own maybe 2 or 3 shifts total, and washing them requires hauling water, heating it, scrubbing fabric against a washboard, and drying everything outside where it might freeze in winter. So you wear each shift until the smell becomes unbearable, even by 1776 standards, and then you wash it and rotate to the next one. If you're a man, you're wearing a long linen shirt that serves the same purpose. Underwear, sleepwear, and the innermost layer of your daily clothing all in one economical garment. The shift or shirt is the only barrier between your skin and the rougher outer garments, and this matters because outer garments are rarely washed. The wool, leather, and heavy linen that make up coats, waistcoats, breeches, and bodices would be damaged by frequent washing, so these items are aired out, brushed down, and spot cleaned but never fully submerged in water. The shift absorbs your sweat and body oils, protecting these investment pieces. When historians examine surviving colonial garments, they often find the outer layers surprisingly clean, while the inner layers, when they survive at all, show evidence of heavy use. Over your shift, if you're a woman, comes the stays. These are not the tightly laced Victorian corsets that popular imagination conjures. Colonial stays are structured garments reinforced with strips of whalebone or wood, designed to support the bust and create the fashionable smooth, conical silhouette of the era. They're surprisingly comfortable by historical standards. You can work in them, bend in them, even nurse a baby in them if they're designed properly. But they must be laced up the back, which means you need help getting dressed every single morning. Privacy and independence are luxuries that extend to basic bodily functions. You cannot dress yourself without assistance. Men have their own complicated layers. Over the long shirt comes the waistcoat, a fitted garment that buttons up the front and provides warmth and formality. Over the waistcoat comes the coat, longer and heavier, with those distinctive wide cuffs and broad skirts you've seen in paintings. Beneath everything, men wear breeches, knee-length pants that button or tie at the waist and fasten below the knee, with buckles or ties. There are no elastic waistbands, no zippers, no quick-release mechanisms. Getting dressed requires threading ties through holes, fastening buttons that are often undersized and stubborn, and generally fighting with garments that seem designed for immobility. Speaking of buttons, they're a minor luxury. Ordinary working people often use hooks, ties, and pins rather than buttons, which must be imported or manufactured by skilled craftsmen. If your coat has real buttons, they're likely made of wood, bone, or base metal rather than the fancy brass or silver versions seen on wealthy gentlemen. Everything about your clothing speaks to your economic status. The fineness of the weave, the richness of the dyes, the quality of the fastenings. Historians can often determine a person's approximate class and occupation just by examining surviving garments. And about those dyes, you're probably wearing brown, or grey, or a faded, indeterminate colour that started as something brighter, but has been beaten into submission by sun, smoke, and repeated washing. Bright colours require expensive dyes derived from insects, minerals, or imported plants. Indigo creates that rich blue you've seen in some colonial portraits, but indigo is grown primarily in South Carolina, using enslaved labour and commands premium prices. Most working people wear the natural colours of undyed wool and linen, the creams and browns and greys of the fibres themselves. You might have one garment in a brighter colour, save for Sundays and special occasions, but daily wear is decidedly drab. Your feet present their own challenges. Stockings, knitted tubes of wool or linen, must be pulled up over your calves and secured with garters tied just below the knee. Women wear stockings too, hidden beneath their long skirts, held up by the same system of ties and knots. Then come the shoes, those unshaped leather blocks we discussed earlier. Buckles fasten them if you can afford buckles. Ties serve the same purpose for those who can't. The shoes offer minimal support, no arch cushioning, and will rub blisters on your feet until your skin toughens into calluses that could stop a musket ball. In winter, add more layers. A cloak or greatcoat goes over everything for outdoor work. Mittens or rough gloves protect your hands. A hat is essential. You lose enormous amounts of body heat through your head. And hats serve practical purposes far beyond fashion. Men's hats have those wide brims for shade in summer and rain protection in winter. Women's caps, worn indoors and out, keep hair contained and provide modest coverage according to social expectations. Going bareheaded is unusual and slightly suspect, a sign of poverty or perhaps moral laxness. The entire process of getting dressed takes 15 to 20 minutes even when you're practiced at it, and you need help with certain garments regardless of how experienced you are. This is one reason why colonial households are so communal. You literally cannot function independently. You need someone to lace your stays, to check that your back layers are lying flat, to tell you if your cap is crooked. The family that dresses together stays together, mostly because they have no other option. Here's a quirky detail that historians find particularly fascinating. Pockets. Women's clothing in 1776 doesn't have built-in pockets. Instead, you wear a separate pocket, essentially a fabric pouch, tied around your waist beneath your outer skirts. To access it, you reach through a slit in your overskirt and dig around in this hidden bag for your handkerchief, your coins, your small necessities. Pickpockets know this design well, and women guard their pockets carefully in crowded spaces. Men's breeches have pockets, and men's coats have pockets, giving them a mobility advantage that seems designed specifically to irritate women for the next 2 centuries. You're finally dressed. It's taken time you probably felt you couldn't spare, and already the morning is marching forward without you. The fire needs tending. The animals are lowing outside. Your clothing feels heavy and restrictive compared to the imaginary comfortable future clothes you can't actually remember anymore. But this is your body now, wrapped in linen and wool and leather, armoured against a cold world in the only way available to you. You take a breath. The stays compress your ribs just slightly. The stockings are already sliding down. The shoes pinch. None of this matters because there's work to do, and the work won't wait for you to be comfortable. The smell hits you the moment you step fully into wakefulness, though after a lifetime of exposure, you barely register it consciously. But let's pause here, in this early morning moment, and catalogue exactly what your nose is processing. This sensory inventory matters because nothing about 1776 will prepare you for the modern world's obsession with eliminating odours, and nothing about the modern world prepares you for this. First, the chamber pot. Yes, we've discussed it, but we haven't fully honoured its contribution to the aromatic landscape of your home. It sits near the bed, partially covered but far from sealed, containing the overnight deposits of your entire family. In winter, when it's too cold to make frequent trips to the privy, it might sit indoors all day, being used by everyone, emptied only when completely full, or when someone finally can't stand it anymore. The ammonia sharpness of urine mingles with other darker notes you've stopped noticing. Your visitors from the future would be gasping. Second, bodies. You haven't bathed recently. Neither has anyone in your family. Neither has anyone you'll encounter today. The concept of daily bathing doesn't exist. In fact, many people believe that frequent immersion in water is dangerous, opening the pores to disease and chill. You might wash your face and hands occasionally. You might splash water under your arms if the smell becomes truly oppressive. But a full bath, in which you heat enough water to fill a tub and then submerge your entire body. That's a rare event, perhaps a few times a year, often associated with illness or some special occasion. Your body smells like a body that works hard, sweats heavily, and is cleaned infrequently. So does everyone else's body. The collective human funk of 1776 is a constant, inescapable presence. Third, animals. If your family keeps livestock, and most families do, those animals live in close proximity to you. The barn might be attached to the house for warmth and convenience. Chickens wander freely, depositing their gifts wherever they please. The family pig roots around in the yard, contributing its particular pungency. Cows and horses generate enormous quantities of manure that must be shoveled, collected, and eventually spread on fields as fertilizer. The smell of animal waste is simply part of the ambient environment. You walk through it, work in it, and probably have traces of it on your shoes right now. Fourth, the fire. Wood smoke is romantic in small doses, the crackle of a campfire, the cosy scent of a fireplace, but you're living in wood smoke all day, every day. It permeates your clothes, your hair, your skin. It hangs in the air inside your home, a permanent haze that stings your eyes if you look directly at the flames. The smoke carries particles of whatever you're burning, which is often not clean-burning hardwood, but whatever scraps of fuel you can find. Your lungs process smoke constantly. Your sense of smell has adapted by becoming partially numb to it. Fifth, food. The cooking smells in a colonial home are not the appetizing aromas of a modern kitchen with its ventilation hoods and sealed ovens. Food in various stages of preparation, preservation and decay exists throughout your living space. Meat hangs in the chimney to smoke. Onions and herbs dry on strings suspended from rafters. Somewhere, something is probably beginning to turn, and you'll eat it anyway because waste is not an option. The intermingled scents of cooking, preserving, and spoiling create a complex background note that's present in every breath. Sixth, the great outdoors. Step outside and you encounter mud. Not ordinary mud, but mud enriched with animal waste, human waste that's been dumped from chamber pots, and the general runoff of daily life. The street in front of your home, if there is a street, is a repository for garbage, dead animals, and anything else that needs disposing. Urban areas are worse, but even rural homesteads feature a distinctive cocktail of organic decomposition. Historians still argue whether colonial Americans had truly lost all sense of smell, or whether they simply didn't associate these odours with danger and disgust the way we do. Here's a quirky fact. Attempts at perfuming and deodorizing did exist, though they were largely ineffective. Wealthy individuals might carry pomanders, small containers of perfume substances, to hold beneath their noses when venturing into particularly offensive areas. Herbs like lavender and rosemary were strewn on floors to release pleasant scents when walked upon. Some people believed that strong smells could ward off disease, which was accidentally correct in the sense that certain plants do have antibacterial properties, though the reasoning was entirely wrong. They thought disease travelled through bad air, the miasma theory. So covering up bad smells with good smells seemed medically sound. The lack of plumbing compounds everything. There are no drains carrying waste away to somewhere else. There are no taps bringing clean water in. Every drop of water used in your home was carried there by human effort, and every drop of waste must be carried away the same way. This creates a calculus of effort that modern people never consider. Is this particular need worth hauling water for? Is this particular waste worth disposing of properly? Often the answer is no, and compromises are made that would horrify a modern sanitation engineer. Your privy, the outhouse, stands some distance from your home, far enough to keep the worst smells away, but close enough to reach in the middle of the night if absolutely necessary. It's a wooden structure built over a pit, featuring a plank with one or more holes cut through it. That's the toilet. No flush, no privacy beyond the walls of the structure itself, no toilet paper. The pit fills slowly with waste and eventually must be dug out and relocated. A job so unpleasant that families sometimes simply abandon old privies and dig new ones. In cities, the situation becomes significantly worse. Chamber pots are dumped from upper-story windows, sometimes with a shouted warning and sometimes not. Open sewers run through street centres. Animals are slaughtered in public spaces, their blood and offal left for dogs and rats and weather to deal with. The population density that makes cities exciting also makes them olfactory nightmares. A city resident in 1776 inhabits a smellscape that would send most modern people fleeing for the countryside within hours. And yet life goes on. Families eat meals, lovers court, children play, business gets conducted. The smell is simply the smell, neither remarkable nor particularly distressing to those who know nothing different. Your nose has calibrated itself to this baseline, and you'd probably find a modern home with its artificial fragrances, chemical cleaners, and aggressive deodorizing equally strange and off-putting. Smell is cultural, and your culture smells like survival. The morning grows brighter, the chamber pot awaits emptying, the animals await feeding, and you, marinated in the accumulated aromas of 18th century life, are ready to begin your day. The fire needs more wood. This simple fact dominates your morning, your afternoon, and your evening. It will dominate tomorrow and the day after and every day until you die, or until someone invents central heating, which won't happen for another century or so. You are, in a very real sense, enslaved to fire, its constant hunger, its need for attention, its absolute necessity for survival. Without fire you cannot cook, you cannot stay warm, you cannot see after dark. Fire is life, and feeding fire is therefore the most essential chore in your household. You step outside to the woodpile, and immediately the cold bites at any exposed skin. November in the colonies ranges from uncomfortable to deadly depending on your latitude, and even the more moderate regions require significant heating to make homes habitable. Your woodpile represents weeks or months of labour, trees felled, logs split, pieces stacked and dried. An average colonial household burns between 20 and 40 cords of wood per year, and a cord of wood is a stack measuring 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. That's an enormous amount of timber that must be cut, transported, split, and stored before winter arrives. If you fail to prepare adequately, you'll spend the cold months in a progressively more desperate search for fuel, burning furniture, fence posts, anything that might produce heat. Splitting wood is brutally physical work. The axe is heavy, the logs are stubborn. Your technique must be precise or you'll exhaust yourself achieving nothing. The colonists who survive are strong, not because they work out at a gym, but because daily life demands constant physical exertion. Every calorie they consume gets burned in labour. Every muscle gets used. The romantic image of the hearty colonial farmer is actually fairly accurate. These people are tough in ways that modern gym-goers can barely imagine. Their bodies forge through necessity rather than choice. You carry an armload of split wood back inside and stack it near the hearth. This wood must dry further before burning efficiently. Wet wood smokes excessively and produces less heat. A skilled firekeeper maintains multiple stages of wood around the fireplace. Thoroughly dried pieces ready for immediate use, slightly green pieces that will be ready in a few days, and fresh splits that need longer to cure. Managing this rotation is one of the countless small skills that everyone in 1776 knows, and that we've completely forgotten. Water is the other constant demand. Your household has no plumbing, remember, so every drop of water used for cooking, cleaning, washing and drinking must be carried from its source. That source might be a well in your yard, a nearby stream, or a communal well in the village centre. The distance varies, but the labour doesn't. Water is heavy, about 8 pounds per gallon, and a household might use 20 to 30 gallons per day for basic functions. That's 200 pounds of water, minimum, carried by hand every single day. When your great-grandmother complained about woman's work, this is what she meant. The hauling usually falls to women and children, who make multiple trips per day with buckets and yokes. A wooden yoke that fits across the shoulders allows you to carry 2 buckets simultaneously, balancing the load. But even so, the work is back-breaking. You learn to economise water ruthlessly, using the same water multiple times, washing vegetables and then using that water for scrubbing, saving the cleanest water for cooking and drinking while dirtier water goes to animals or is dumped outside. Beyond fire and water, the daily chores multiply endlessly. Animals must be fed, watered and cared for. Cows must be milked twice daily, a process that takes practised hands about 20 minutes per cow, and the milking must happen regardless of weather, illness or any other circumstance, because a cow that isn't milked regularly will dry up and become useless. Eggs must be collected, pigs must be slopped. Horses, if your family is fortunate enough to own one, require grooming and exercising. The barn needs mucking out periodically, which is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. Inside the house, the work is equally relentless. The fire requires constant attention, logs added, coal stirred, ash removed. The single room that serves as living space, kitchen and bedroom must be swept, though the dirt floor means swept is a relative term. Cooking takes hours, not because the recipes are complex, but because the methods are slow. Bread must be kneaded and baked. Stews must simmer for extended periods to tenderize tough meat. Every meal requires planning hours in advance, coordinating the fire's heat with the food's readiness. Laundry deserves special mention as one of the most labour-intensive chores in the colonial household. Washing clothes by hand, without hot running water or detergent, requires soaking, scrubbing, boiling, rinsing and drying, a process that consumes an entire day and leaves the washer exhausted. Clothes are washed infrequently precisely because the work is so demanding. You might do a full household laundry once every few weeks, or once a month, scheduling it around other responsibilities and weather conditions that allow for outdoor drying. Historians still argue about exactly how colonial families divided this labour, but general patterns are clear. Women managed the household, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, textile production, while men worked the fields, maintained buildings, and handled heavier agricultural tasks. Children worked as soon as they were physically able, with even toddlers contributing by gathering eggs or carrying small loads. There was no distinction between childhood and work. Children were simply small workers with limited capabilities that grew as they did. The concept of free time barely exists in this world. From the moment you wake until the moment you collapse back onto your straw mattress, your hours are filled with tasks that must be done for survival. Leisure is not a daily experience. It's something that might happen on Sundays after church, or during winter evenings when darkness limits outdoor work, or occasionally during community gatherings that combine work and socializing. The idle hours that modern people fritter away scrolling through phones would be incomprehensible luxury. Your arms ache from carrying wood. Your shoulders protest from the water yoke's pressure. Your hands are chapped and calloused from work that never ends. But the fire is burning strong now, the water bucket is full, and the animals are fed and quiet in their barn. For this moment you've stayed ahead of survival's demands. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. The small body beside you stirs and a hand reaches up to tug at your clothing. This is your younger sibling, or perhaps your own child if you're old enough to have one, and they're already dressed in a smaller version of your own uncomfortable garments, already awake, already expected to contribute to the household's functioning. Childhood in 1776 is not the protected, play-centred experience you might imagine. Children are economic assets, small workers whose labour is essential to family survival, and their play is often just work made slightly more bearable by youthful energy. By age 4 or 5, children in colonial America have regular chores. They might gather eggs from the henhouse, learning early to move slowly and speak softly around the nervous birds. They might carry water in small buckets sized for their bodies, making the same trips their mothers make but in miniature. They card wool, pulling raw fleece through spiked boards to align the fibres for spinning, a tedious task that requires little skill but endless patience. A child can card wool while an adult spins, their small hands contributing to the textile production that keeps the family clothed. By 7 or 8, the expectations increase substantially. Boys begin working alongside their fathers in the fields, learning to handle animals, drive ploughs and wield tools that could easily maim them if they're careless. Girls join their mothers in the endless cycle of household work, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, caring for younger siblings who are constantly underfoot. The idea of age-appropriate tasks doesn't exist in the modern sense. Children do whatever they're physically capable of doing, and they're pushed to become capable as quickly as possible. Education, for those who receive it at all, is squeezed into the margins of working life. A farmer's son might attend school during winter months when agricultural demands are lowest, learning basic reading, writing, and arithmetic from a schoolmaster who might barely know more than his students. Girls often receive less formal education than boys, their literacy considered less essential since their future lies in household management, rather than commerce or professions. Even privileged children spend far less time in formal schooling than modern students, perhaps a few hours daily, a few months yearly, with extensive practical education filling the remainder. The emotional landscape of colonial childhood differs dramatically from modern expectations. Parents love their children, certainly, but they express that love differently than we might. Physical affection is less common or less discussed. Discipline is strict and often physical. The phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," is taken literally. Children are addressed formally, expected to speak respectfully to adults, and reminded constantly of their place in the family hierarchy. A child who questions parental authority isn't seen as independent-minded. They're seen as dangerously undisciplined, in need of correction. Death shadows childhood in ways that modern families rarely experience. Infant mortality rates hover around 20 to 30%. Roughly 1 in 4 or 5 babies born alive will not survive to their first birthday. Childhood diseases that vaccines now prevent sweep through communities with devastating regularity. Smallpox, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria. These aren't historical curiosities to colonial families. They're present dangers that claim children with terrible frequency. Every parent in 1776 knows someone who has lost a child. Many have lost children themselves. Historians still argue whether this high mortality rate made parents emotionally distant from their children, a protective mechanism against inevitable grief, or whether it made them treasure each surviving child even more intensely. You've likely attended siblings' funerals. You remember, vaguely, faces that are no longer at the table, a baby who arrived and departed in the same season, an older brother claimed by fever, a sister who cut herself and developed the infection that turned her skin red and hot before she stopped breathing. These memories are painful but not unusual. They're simply part of the texture of life in an era before antibiotics, before vaccines, before the medical advances that make modern childhood so comparatively safe. Play does happen, though it often interweaves with work and lacks the organised, supervised character of modern children's activities. Colonial children play with what's available: balls made from rags or leather, dolls carved from wood or sewn from scraps, hoops and sticks, games of chase and hide-and-seek that require no equipment at all. They swim in creeks during summer, if water is nearby. They slide on ice in winter. They invent games and stories and worlds, the way children have always done when given any margin of freedom from adult demands. But that margin is narrow. A child caught playing when they should be working faces swift correction. The necessity of constant labour leaves little tolerance for idleness, which is viewed not just as unproductive but as morally suspect. Children learn early that their value lies in their contribution, what they can do, what they can produce, how they can help the family survive. Self-worth in 1776 is earned through work, not guaranteed by existence. The child beside you, let's say it's your younger brother, has finished his thin breakfast and is looking at you expectantly. He knows his chores. He knows yours too, probably, since everyone's business is everyone else's business in a household this small and this interconnected. You nod at him, and he scurries off toward the henhouse, bucket swinging from one small hand. He's 6 years old. He's been working for 2 years already. He'll work every day of his life until he dies, whenever that turns out to be. You watch him go, this small figure bundled in wool and determination, and you feel something that might be affection, or might be resignation, or might be both at once. Childhood is short in 1776. Adulthood is long and hard. The only way to prepare children for what awaits them is to start the preparation early, to build their bodies, their skills, their capacity for endurance through the only method available, making them do it. The henhouse door swings open. Small hands reach for eggs. Another day of work has begun for all of you. If you inhabit a woman's body in 1776, your experience of daily life differs substantially from a man's, though the core reality of constant labour remains the same. You wake to the same cold, eat the same thin breakfast, dress in garments equally uncomfortable though differently constructed. But from that shared beginning, your day diverges into a parallel track of responsibilities, expectations and limitations that shape every aspect of your existence. Your primary role, as colonial society sees it, is reproduction. You're expected to marry young, many women wed between 16 and 22, and to produce children regularly throughout your fertile years. A woman who survives her childbearing years might have given birth 8, 10, 12 times. She might have buried half those children before they reached adulthood. Each pregnancy carries genuine risk. Maternal mortality hovers around 1 to 2% per birth, which sounds small until you multiply it across 10 or 12 pregnancies and realise that a woman faces perhaps a 15 to 20% lifetime chance of dying in childbirth. Historians still argue about exact figures, but the general picture is clear. Pregnancy is dangerous. Birth is dangerous. The period after birth, when infections claim many new mothers, is perhaps most dangerous of all. You're expected to manage the household, which in 1776 means something far more extensive than modern housekeeping. You don't just clean and cook, you produce. You spin thread from raw wool or flax, working a spinning wheel for hours to create the continuous fibres that will become cloth. You weave on a loom, interlacing threads into fabric through a process that requires skill, patience, and physical stamina. You sew and mend, transforming that fabric into garments that will clothe your family. You preserve food, smoking meats, pickling vegetables, drying fruits, so that summer's abundance can sustain winter's scarcity. You make soap, rendering animal fat and mixing it with lye to create the harsh cleaning agent that will serve your household's needs. You make candles, dipping wicks into melted tallow again and again to build up the layers that will provide light through dark evenings. Each of these tasks requires specialized knowledge passed down through generations of women. Your mother taught you to spin. Her mother taught her the rhythms of the wheel, the tension of the thread, the angle of your hands. These are learned through practice and correction, skills as technical as any tradesman's, though rarely valued as highly. The transformation of raw materials into finished goods happens in your hands, invisible labour that keeps the household functioning but earns little recognition beyond the family. Legally, you have few independent rights. If you're married, the legal doctrine of coverture means your identity is subsumed under your husband's. You cannot own property in your own name. You cannot sign contracts. You cannot sue or be sued. You cannot vote, though in 1776 most men can't vote either due to property requirements. Your husband controls your labour, your earnings if you have any, your children. Divorce is technically possible in some colonies, but practically nearly impossible, requiring legislative action and extraordinary circumstances. You're bound to your marriage for life, for better or for worse, with very little recourse if the worst becomes unbearable. This legal non-personhood doesn't mean you're entirely powerless. Within the household, you often exercise significant authority. You manage resources, direct children's labour, make countless daily decisions about the family's welfare. Your husband may earn the income, or produce the crops that serve as income, but you transform that raw material into a functioning household. A lazy or incompetent wife can destroy a family's prospects just as surely as a lazy or incompetent husband. Men know this, and prudent men consult their wives about significant decisions even when the law doesn't require it. You might also engage in economic activity beyond your household. Many colonial women earn money through domestic manufacture, selling surplus butter, eggs, cheese, woven cloth, or other products of their household labour. You might take in boarders, providing room and meals for travellers or young single workers. You might serve as a midwife, attending births throughout your community, in a role that combines medical expertise with spiritual support. These earnings are technically your husband's property, but in practice many women maintain separate PIN money accounts that give them small measures of financial independence. Widowhood offers both tragedy and freedom. When your husband dies, you suddenly acquire legal personhood. You can own property, sign contracts, conduct business in your own name. Many widows run family farms and businesses successfully, demonstrating capabilities that marriage laws had obscured. The practical experience of managing households translates effectively into managing enterprises, but widowhood also means vulnerability. A woman alone faces economic challenges in a world designed around male breadwinners, and remarriage is often necessary for survival rather than chosen for love. Here's something that might surprise you. Women in colonial America often work alongside men in ways that later Victorian ideals will discourage. The separation of home and workplace hasn't happened yet. The family farm, the family shop, the family trade, these are all home, and women participate in them directly. A farmer's wife helps in the fields during harvest. A shopkeeper's wife manages the store during his absences. A craftsman's wife often learns enough of his trade to assist and potentially continue the business if he dies. The idealized cult of domesticity that will confine middle-class women to purely household roles is still decades in the future. Your days are long. Your work is constant. Your body bears the evidence of labour and childbearing in ways that would shock modern expectations. Your hands are rough. Your back often aches. Your teeth, like everyone's teeth, are deteriorating. But within the limits of your era, you possess competence, authority, and purpose. You're not a passive ornament. You're an essential worker whose skills keep your family alive. That's worth something, even if the law refuses to recognize it. The land stretches before you, and it demands everything you have. If you're among the 90% of colonial Americans who work the soil, your life revolves around agricultural rhythms that modern people have almost entirely forgotten. You plant when the earth says plant. You harvest when the crops say harvest. You cannot negotiate with nature, cannot postpone its deadlines, cannot call in sick during the seasons that determine whether your family eats or starves. The land is your employer, your provider, and your master all at once. November offers a brief respite. The harvest is mostly complete. The corn gathered, the wheat threshed, the vegetables stored in the root cellar that stays cool enough to preserve them through winter. This is the season for slaughtering livestock that won't survive the cold months, preserving meat through smoking and salting, and preparing for the long hibernation of winter when agricultural work largely ceases. But even in this quieter season, the farm demands attention. Fences need mending before snow makes repair impossible. Tools require sharpening and maintenance. The barn must be weatherproofed, its gaps stuffed with mud and straw to protect the animals who will shelter there. Colonial farming is not the mechanized operation you might imagine when you think of farms. You have no tractor, no combine, no powered equipment of any kind. You have hand tools, hoes, sickles, scythes, axes, and you have animal power if you're fortunate enough to own a horse or ox. Every seed you plant goes into the ground because you or your family members put it there, bent over the soil, moving down rows that seem endless. Every weed that threatens your crops must be pulled by hand. Every harvest requires cutting, gathering, binding, and transporting through human and animal effort. The calorie math of colonial farming is brutal. You expend enormous energy producing food, hoping the food you produce exceeds the energy you spent producing it. The crops themselves differ somewhat from what modern farms grow. Corn is the staple of colonial agriculture, a New World plant that Native Americans cultivated for millennia before European contact. You plant it in hills, several seeds per mound, often interplanted with beans that climb the cornstalks and squash that spreads along the ground shading the soil, a Three Sisters approach learned from indigenous farmers. Wheat grows in more northern regions and requires more processing than corn, but makes better bread. Rye, oats, and barley serve various purposes. Vegetables fill kitchen gardens: beans, peas, turnips, carrots, cabbages, onions. Herbs grow near the house for cooking and medicine. Tobacco dominates in the Chesapeake region, though we're focusing on northern and middle colonies where food crops take priority. Still, it's worth noting that tobacco cultivation shaped southern colonial life profoundly, creating plantation systems dependent on enslaved labour. We'll return to this later. For now, understand that colonial agriculture isn't uniform. It varies enormously by region, soil type, climate, and local tradition. Historians still argue about whether colonial farming methods were sustainable or whether they exhausted soil fertility in ways that would require future generations to adapt. Weather determines everything, and you can do nothing about weather. A late frost kills seedlings, a summer drought stunts growth, too much rain rots roots, an early autumn freeze catches crops before harvest. Every farmer knows stories of years when everything went wrong, when the weather conspired to destroy months of labour and leave families facing winter with empty storehouses. These disasters happen not annually, but regularly enough that everyone maintains a healthy respect for agricultural uncertainty. You plant more than you need, save seed for replanting, keep emergency reserves, pray, and hope. The isolation of farm life shapes social experience as well. Your neighbours are probably not within shouting distance. A visit to the nearest village might take hours of walking or riding. News arrives slowly, through travellers and occasional newspapers that are weeks or months old by the time you read them. The revolutionary fervour sweeping through Boston and Philadelphia reaches you in fragments, rumoured conversations, second-hand reports of battles and declarations. You know something important is happening, but the daily reality of farming leaves little time for politics. The corn doesn't care about independence. The pigs still need feeding regardless of what Congress decides. Yet the war touches even remote farms in concrete ways. Armies need food, and both continental and British forces requisition supplies from rural areas. They might pay, in currency that may or may not hold value, or they might simply take what they need and leave you with a receipt promising future compensation. Soldiers march through your fields, trampling crops. Battles rage somewhere over the horizon, and refugees fleeing those battles appear at your door seeking shelter. The separation between war and daily life that modern people might assume existed doesn't really exist. War is happening in your backyard, affecting your food supply, potentially threatening your family. Your relationship with the land is intimate in ways that modern farming has lost. You know your fields not as data points on a satellite map, but as physical spaces you've walked thousands of times. You know which corner stays wet too long in spring, which hillside catches the earliest sun, Which trees mark the boundary you've never quite agreed upon with your neighbour? The land holds memories. Here's where you planted your first crop under your father's guidance. Here's where your brother was working when he died. Here's where you found that arrowhead that still sits on your mantle. The land is not just productive resource, it's home, heritage, and identity. The sun moves overhead, indifferent to your concerns. The chickens scratch in the yard. The wind carries the smell of wood smoke and decomposing leaves. Another day on the farm settles into its familiar rhythms, and you settle with it. Something warm and distinctly smelly shifts against your leg, and you accept this without surprise. The pig has found its way indoors again, seeking the warmth of the fire, and honestly, you understand the impulse. Colonial homes are cold, and animals are smart enough to want shelter. The arrangement benefits everyone, sort of. In many colonial households, particularly in colder regions, animals live in startlingly close proximity to humans. The barn might be attached to the house, sharing a wall that allows animal body heat to contribute to household warmth. Chickens roost in corners. The family pig, and pigs are remarkably intelligent creatures who remember where the food and warmth are, wanders through living spaces when doors aren't carefully guarded. Cats exist for mouse control, a working relationship rather than pure companionship. Dogs serve as guards, hunters, and occasionally emergency food supplies in desperate times. The modern concept of pets as purely emotional companions exists among the wealthy, but remains a luxury that working families can't quite afford. The pig is your family's primary meat source, a concentrated investment of food and labour that will pay off in the late autumn slaughter. You've fed this pig kitchen scraps, whey from cheese making, and whatever else it can forage throughout the year. Pigs are wonderfully efficient garbage processors, transforming waste into protein. They're also surprisingly clean animals despite their reputation. They only wallow in mud to cool themselves and protect against sunburn, and they prefer not to defecate where they sleep. Your pig has a name, probably, and your younger siblings have certainly developed affection for it. This affection will not save it. When slaughter time comes, the pig will become ham and bacon and lard and sausage, every part used because waste is unthinkable. Cows occupy a more complicated position in colonial agriculture. They're enormously valuable. A good milk cow might cost as much as a labourer earns in a year. But they're also high maintenance. Cows need significant quantities of hay and grain through the winter, requiring stockpiles of fodder that must be prepared during summer months. They must be milked twice daily, every single day, regardless of weather or human convenience. They're prone to various illnesses. They can die suddenly from causes no one fully understands. A family that loses its cow loses a major capital asset alongside its dairy supply. Many families can't afford cattle and rely on neighbours, or simply go without fresh milk. Horses are status symbols as much as working animals. Owning a horse transforms your mobility, your agricultural capacity, and your social standing. But horses eat even more than cows, require shoeing and veterinary care, and can injure or kill careless handlers. The work that one horse can do might also be done by a team of oxen, slower but stronger and more forgiving of rough treatment. Many colonial farmers choose oxen over horses for practical purposes, accepting the trade-off of speed for reliability. Chickens are practically universal. Even the poorest families keep a few hens for eggs, and the occasional meat bird. Chickens require little specialised care, forage much of their own food, and reproduce readily. They're noisy, messy, and apparently incapable of not wandering into places they shouldn't be, but they provide protein that would otherwise be scarce. Gathering eggs is often the first chore assigned to young children, a daily lesson in responsibility and animal behaviour. Sheep appear on farms that have enough pasture to support them, providing wool for spinning and occasional meat. Goats serve similar purposes in rougher terrain. Geese offer eggs, meat, feathers, and remarkably aggressive guard animal services. Every animal on a colonial farm serves multiple purposes. Companionship alone doesn't justify the resources required to keep an animal fed through winter. The arrangement creates a distinctive domestic environment that would disturb modern sensibilities about hygiene and boundaries. Animal waste appears in places where animals appear, which is everywhere. Fleas, lice, and other parasites jump freely between species. The diseases of animals and the diseases of humans overlap in ways that create persistent low-level illness throughout populations. But the arrangement also creates warmth, literally. animal body heat contributes measurably to household temperature, and a kind of integrated life that connects humans and animals in ways we've severed. Historians still argue about whether colonial Americans viewed their animals with affection, or purely as resources. The evidence suggests both, depending on circumstance. Farmers develop relationships with animals they work alongside daily. Children name chickens and cry when those chickens become dinner. The slaughter of the family pig is both celebration and grief, a necessary act that ends a relationship. Modern people who keep animals might recognize this complicated emotional territory. You can love something and eat it, or at least colonial Americans could. Here's a quirky detail. Animal trials. Yes, colonial America occasionally put animals on trial for crimes. Pigs were prosecuted for injuring or killing children. Bulls were tried for murder. The practice seems absurd by modern standards, but it reflects a worldview that held animals morally accountable for their actions in ways our legal system no longer acknowledges. The pig that bit the neighbour's child might face a formal proceeding before facing execution, a strange ceremony that combined legal process with what we might now call animal control. The pig at your feet grunts contentedly, unaware of its approaching fate. You reach down and scratch behind its ear, knowing you'll miss this creature when it's gone, knowing you'll be grateful for the food it provides. The ambivalence is familiar. Everything in 1776 carries this quality of doubleness, valuable and burdensome, cherished and consumed, present and always potentially gone. The morning has advanced, and your stomach reminds you that the thin porridge you consumed hours ago has long since converted to energy and burned away. But this isn't breakfast time anymore. It's dinner time, confusingly. The colonial meal schedule bears no resemblance to the breakfast-lunch-dinner pattern you might expect. What we call lunch, they call dinner, and it's the largest, most important meal of the day. Dinner happens around noon, time to coincide with the sun's height and the worker's greatest need for sustenance. You've been labouring for hours already, hauling water, feeding animals, working whatever task the season demands, and your body needs fuel to continue. The evening meal, called supper, will be smaller, often just leftovers from dinner or a simple soup, eaten by firelight before bed. Breakfast was practically non-existent, as we've established. The colonial eating schedule concentrates calories in the middle of the day when they'll be most useful. The dinner table groans, or it would if colonial tables could groan, under a spread that looks more substantial than the porridge morning offered. The pot over the fire contains something hot, maybe a stew of root vegetables, with a bit of salted meat for flavour, maybe a thick soup of beans and whatever herbs grew in the garden. Bread appears, the slightly stale remnants of the last baking day, still edible if you don't mind chewing hard. Someone has brought up a crock of preserved vegetables from the root cellar. Pickles, perhaps, or sauerkraut, the fermented cabbage that provides vitamins through the winter months when fresh vegetables are impossible. If today is special in some way, a Sunday, a feast day, a celebration, there might be meat. Real meat, not just the flavouring essence of a ham bone in soup, but actual slices of pork or possibly chicken, if someone has decided a hen has reached the end of her laying career. Meat is precious enough that its appearance marks an occasion. Ordinary dinners feature it sparingly, if at all, stretching the available protein across as many meals as possible. The family gathers around the table, assuming there's a table. Many households eat standing, sitting on benches, or simply wherever they happen to be. The father sits first as head of household and offers a brief prayer of thanks before anyone touches food. These prayers are sincere, not mere ritual. The food before you represents months of labour, vulnerability to weather and disease, the blessing of survival in a world where survival is never guaranteed. You're genuinely thankful for this meal because you know, viscerally, that it might not have happened. Utensils are limited. You might have a wooden spoon that's been in the family for years, its bowl worn smooth by countless meals. You almost certainly don't have a personal fork. Forks exist, but are considered somewhat effeminate and unnecessary by many colonists who prefer eating with knives and fingers. You definitely don't have multiple forks, a salad fork, a dessert fork, the specialised cutlery that modern dining has invented. One utensil, maybe two, plus your hands. The soup is drunk from the bowl, the bread is torn and dipped. The meat, if present, is cut with a shared knife and eaten with fingers. Everyone eats from common dishes rather than individual plates. The trencher, a thick slice of stale bread or a wooden board, might hold your portion, but you're reaching into the same pot, the same bowls, the same shared food supply as everyone else. Hygiene concerns about this practice would strike colonial diners as excessive. We're all family here, living in close quarters, sharing air and water and beds. Why would we not share food? The taste of colonial food is difficult to reconstruct because taste is so subjective and culturally shaped. Spices are rare and expensive. Pepper is a luxury, cinnamon a treasure. Salt is precious, used primarily for preservation rather than seasoning. Sugar exists, but at costs that make it a rare indulgence. The colonial palate has adapted to foods that modern Americans would find bland, under-seasoned, and texturally challenging. But to you, sitting at this table in 1776, the stew tastes like stew. It tastes like what food tastes like. Your baseline for comparison doesn't include the engineered hyper-palatability of modern processed foods, so this simple meal satisfies in ways that might surprise contemporary eaters. Cider accompanies the meal, probably hard cider since fresh cider ferments quickly, and alcohol is the default state of many colonial beverages. The cider is slightly sour, faintly sparkling from ongoing fermentation, and provides calories alongside hydration. Children drink it too. Remember, it's safer than water, and everyone drinks it. The alcohol content is low enough that function isn't impaired, though the cumulative effect of constant low-level alcohol consumption probably affects colonial life in ways historians find difficult to measure. Conversation during dinner might be minimal, you're eating quickly because work continues after the meal, or it might be the day's primary social moment. News gets shared, tasks are assigned for the afternoon, complaints are aired carefully because complaining too loudly brings correction. Children are seen and not heard, as the saying goes, though the actual practice varies by family. This is your community, the people you'll spend every day with until death separates you, and dinner is when you remind yourselves of that connection. The meal ends, the dishes, such as they are, need washing, another chore for women and children. The afternoon stretches ahead, full of tasks that won't complete themselves. But for this moment, you're full. Your body has what it needs to continue. The warmth of the fire and the food settle something inside you, a brief contentment before the demands resume. You need salt. Your family is running low, and without salt, meat preservation becomes impossible. Food becomes even more flavourless than usual, and certain essential chemical processes in your body begin to malfunction. Salt is, quite literally, necessary for survival, but salt is expensive, imported, and not something you can produce yourself, unless you live near the ocean with the equipment and knowledge for evaporation. You need to trade for it. Welcome to the colonial economy, where cash money is chronically scarce, and most transactions happen through barter. You have eggs, you have butter, maybe. If your cow is producing and your family has surplus, you have labour, your own strong back and willing hands, which can be traded for goods or services. You have skills, perhaps you can carpenter or spin particularly fine thread, or brew better beer than your neighbours. These assets are your currency in a world where actual currency, pounds, shillings, pence, flows primarily through merchants and the wealthy. The problem with barter is the double coincidence of wants. You need salt, you have eggs. But does the person with salt want eggs? Maybe they have their own chickens, maybe they need wool instead, or help repairing a fence, or someone to watch their children. Finding a trading partner whose needs match your offerings requires patience, networking, and sometimes elaborate multi-party exchanges. You trade eggs to person A for candles. You trade candles to person B for a length of cloth. You trade cloth to person C, who finally has the salt you needed 3 exchanges ago. The inefficiency is staggering by modern standards, but it's simply how things work. Storekeepers serve as crucial intermediaries in this system. A general store in a colonial village stocks imported goods, salt, spices, cloth, tools, rum, that farmers cannot produce themselves. You bring your surplus to the store and receive credit on account. You draw against that credit when you need to purchase. Very little actual money changes hands. The storekeeper tracks balances in a ledger, essentially serving as a bank that deals in goods rather than currency. Your family might maintain an ongoing balance with a particular store for years, decades, across generations. This credit system creates relationships of obligation and dependency that structure colonial society. You owe the storekeeper owes the wholesaler owes the importer. everyone is connected through webs of debt that must eventually be settled, but that sustain commerce in the meantime. Historians still argue about whether this system was primarily cooperative or exploitative, whether it built community through mutual obligation, or trapped farmers in perpetual indebtedness to merchants who controlled access to essential goods. When actual money does appear, it's confusing. There's no standard American currency in 1776 that won't emerge until after the Revolution, and even then it will take decades to stabilise. You might encounter Spanish pieces of 8, the most common trade currency in the Atlantic world. You might receive British pounds and shillings, though these are increasingly scarce as the colonies move toward independence. You might be paid in colonial paper money, which each colony issues independently and which varies enormously in value and acceptance. A Virginia pound is not worth the same as a Pennsylvania pound. Keeping track of exchange rates is a constant headache for anyone engaged in commerce. Here's a quirky economic detail. Wampum, the shell beads that served as currency among Native American nations, is still occasionally used in colonial trade, particularly in regions with ongoing indigenous commerce. The Dutch and early English settlers adopted wampum as money when metal coins were scarce, and the practice persists in some areas even as it fades in others. The beads have no inherent value, they're just shells, but their acceptance as currency makes them valuable, a lesson in the social construction of money that modern economists would appreciate. Prices fluctuate wildly in this unstable monetary environment. The value of goods depends on supply, which depends on weather and shipping and 100 variables beyond anyone's control. The war currently disrupting the colonies, you remember there's a revolution happening, has made everything worse. British blockades interrupt imports. Continental currency depreciates rapidly as Congress prints money to fund the army. The phrase, "not worth a continental," will soon enter the language as description of worthlessness. Economic planning is nearly impossible when you can't predict what anything will cost tomorrow. You approach your neighbour's farm. He's the one with salt to spare, you've heard, acquired somehow through connections in Philadelphia. You carry a basket of eggs, a small jar of honey, and the offer of 3 days' labour during his upcoming barn raising. You'll negotiate, you'll haggle, you'll probably accept less than you'd hoped, and give more than you'd like. But at the end, you'll have salt, and your family will be able to preserve the pork from next week's slaughter. That's what matters. The neighbour greets you, and you begin the familiar dance of colonial commerce. How's your family? How's the farm? Did you hear about the news from Boston? Eventually, casually, the conversation turns to business. You mention the salt. He mentions his needs. Numbers are floated, rejected, adjusted. Nothing is written down. Your word is your bond in a community where everyone knows everyone and reputation is everything. You shake hands, the deal is struck, and the salt is yours. Walking home with your prize, you reflect on how much effort that simple transaction required. Modern, you could buy salt at any grocery store for pocket change, completed in 30 seconds. Colonial, you spent half a day on negotiations, travel and social maintenance just to acquire a basic necessity. This is the tax that primitive commerce levies on every aspect of life. But you have the salt now. The family will eat through winter. That's enough. The church bell rings in the distance, and even though today isn't Sunday, the sound carries meaning. That bell marks time in a world without clocks, announces emergencies, calls gatherings, and reminds everyone within earshot that the church stands at the centre of community life. Religion in colonial America isn't a private matter of personal belief. It's a public institution that structures daily existence, moral behaviour and social belonging. You cannot escape it even if you wanted to, and wanting to escape it would itself be suspicious. Sunday is the pivot point of the week, the day when work ceases, or mostly ceases, since animals still need feeding, and everyone gathers for worship. Church attendance isn't optional. In many colonies, laws require attendance and impose fines on those who skip without valid excuse. The enforcement varies, but the expectation is universal. You go to church because God requires it, because your neighbours are watching, and because absence marks you as potentially dangerous. A person outside the community's shared faith who might harbour other deviant ideas. The service itself is long, very long. Sermons run 1, 2, even 3 hours, and they're not the uplifting, entertaining presentations of modern megachurches. Colonial ministers preach doctrine, heavy on sin and salvation, demanding close attention, and offering little concession to wandering minds. You sit on hard wooden benches without backs. Pews are a luxury that some churches have and others don't, and you listen. Children squirm, adults doze occasionally, though church wardens patrol the aisles with long poles to prod the sleeping back to wakefulness. The theological content is dense, Calvinist in most New England churches, expecting congregants to follow arguments about predestination, grace, and the nature of divine will. Your theological background, if you're a typical colonial American, is more extensive than many modern churchgoers possess. You know the Bible, not necessarily because you've read it yourself, since literacy is variable, but because you've heard it read, discussed, quoted, and expounded upon every week of your life. Biblical stories are the common cultural references that everyone shares. Even illiterate people can discuss Jacob and Esau, David and Goliath, the parables of Jesus. Religion provides the narrative framework through which people understand their world. But here's where it gets complicated. Colonial America is not a single religious culture. The diversity is remarkable, especially in the middle colonies. New England has its congregational establishment, descendants of the Puritans who came seeking religious freedom and then immediately restricted everyone else's religious freedom. Virginia has the Anglican Church, the Church of England transplanted to the colonies and supported by public taxes. Pennsylvania welcomes Quakers, Mennonites, Moravians, and other dissenting groups who fled persecution in Europe. Maryland was founded as a Catholic refuge, though Protestants now outnumber Catholics there. Jews live in port cities, though their numbers are small. This patchwork of beliefs creates a more religiously diverse society than anywhere in Europe. The Great Awakening, a wave of religious revival that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, still echoes in 1776. That movement emphasized emotional, personal religious experience over dry theological doctrine. It democratized religion, suggesting that ordinary people could encounter God directly without priestly intermediaries. It also divided communities between new lights, who embraced revivalism, and old lights, who found it dangerously enthusiastic. Historians still argue whether the Great Awakening planted seeds of democratic thinking that would bloom in revolution, or whether that connection is overdrawn. Religion shapes daily behavior through intricate codes of conduct. You don't work on the Sabbath, and work is defined broadly enough to forbid cooking, travelling, or basically any activity that could be construed as labour or enjoyment. Blue laws prohibit various activities on Sunday. No buying or selling, no public entertainment, no frivolity. These laws remain on the books in some American states to this day. Ghosts of colonial religious regulation. Your entire week is structured around the Sunday requirement. Cook ahead so you don't have to cook on Sunday. Plan travel to arrive before Saturday evening and leave after Monday morning. Religious observance isn't just Sunday. You pray before meals, possibly before and after. You pray at morning and evening. Family devotions gather the household for Bible reading and prayer, reinforcing faith through daily repetition. Children memorize catechisms, question and answer summaries of doctrine before they can read. The rhythms of religious practice are woven so thoroughly into daily life that separating religious from secular would be nearly meaningless. Everything is religious because God is present everywhere, watching, judging, caring. Death makes religion urgent in ways that modern people might find difficult to understand. When a quarter of your children die before adulthood, when disease can claim any person at any age, when you've buried parents, siblings and neighbours in graves you helped dig, eternal life isn't an abstract concept. It's your hope for reunion with everyone you've lost. Heaven is where your mother is now, where your baby brother went, where you yourself will go if you live righteously and die in grace. Hell is equally real, equally present, the alternative fate that awaits sinners. The stakes could not be higher, which is why people take religious observance so seriously. The bell falls silent. The echo fades across fields and forests. Whatever brief reminder of divine presence it offered, life continues. Chores waiting, dinner needing preparation, the endless cycle of survival that precedes whether you feel spiritually centered or not. But the bell will ring again. Sunday will arrive, and you will sit once more in that hard pew, listening, hoping, believing. The afternoon stretches before you, and since today's essential work is complete, you might actually have time for what passes as entertainment in 1776. But don't get too excited. colonial leisure rarely resembles the passive consumption of modern amusement. People don't watch entertainment, they participate in it, and that participation often involves more physical activity, communal interaction, and moral ambiguity than you might expect. The tavern is the entertainment hub of colonial America. Every village has at least one, and larger towns have dozens. Taverns serve alcohol, obviously, rum, whiskey, beer, cider, but they also serve as meeting spaces, news exchanges, lodging houses, and general social centres. Men gather after work, women visit taverns less frequently and under more scrutiny, to drink, talk, argue, gamble, and maintain the social networks that sustain community life. The revolution itself was planned in taverns. The Sons of Liberty met in Boston's Green Dragon Tavern so frequently that it became known as the headquarters of the revolution. Drinking in colonial America approaches levels that would alarm modern public health officials. The average colonist consumed something like 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year, roughly 3 times the modern American average. Part of this reflects the beverage situation we discussed earlier. Alcohol is often safer than water. Part reflects social norms that consider moderate drinking acceptable and even healthy. But part is simply that people drink a lot, get drunk frequently, and colonial society accepts this with surprising tolerance. Public drunkenness is common enough that it's not particularly remarkable unless it results in violence or property damage. Beyond the tavern, entertainment often involves blood. Cockfighting is wildly popular across all social classes. Men breed and train roosters for combat, equip them with metal spurs that transform scratching into slashing, and bet heavily on the outcomes. The fights draw crowds, generate excitement, and distribute significant amounts of money through the gambling economy. Modern sensibilities find this cruel, and we should be honest about that cruelty. Birds die painfully for human amusement. But in a world where animals are routinely slaughtered, where suffering is constant and death is familiar, the violence of cockfighting registers differently. Bull baiting, dogfights, and other animal combat sports exist alongside cockfighting, though their popularity varies by region. Horse racing attracts wealthy patrons who can afford to breed, maintain, and wager quality animals. Hunting provides both food and sport, though the distinction between hunting for survival and hunting for entertainment blurs in a society where meat is always welcome. Fishing offers similar dual purposes. Human violence for entertainment also exists, though it's often informal. Boxing matches, wrestling competitions, and general fighting happen at gatherings, sometimes spontaneously and sometimes arranged. These fights can be brutal, eye-gouging, ear-biting, and other tactics that modern boxing would forbid were considered acceptable in rough-and-tumble fighting. Historians still argue about whether such violence functioned as cathartic release, community entertainment, or evidence of a more brutal society, or perhaps all three simultaneously. Public punishments serve as entertainment of a sort, drawing crowds who watch thieves flogged, adulterers wearing letters of shame, and murderers hanged. The stocks and pillory place offenders on display for public mockery. You're expected to heckle, throw rotting vegetables, and generally humiliate those who've violated community standards. This isn't cruelty for its own sake, though cruelty is certainly present. It's believed to deter crime through shame and to reinforce social norms through collective enforcement. The crowd participates in justice, becoming part of the punishment itself. Gentler entertainments exist too, lest you imagine colonial life as unrelenting brutality. Music is everywhere. Folk songs, hymns, ballads, performed by ordinary people rather than professional entertainers. Dancing accompanies community gatherings, and people learn the steps as part of basic social education. Storytelling passes long evenings when work is finished and candlelight is too dim for reading. Board games, card games, and dice games provide gambling opportunities or simple diversion depending on the stakes. Here's something surprising. Theatre exists in colonial America, but it's controversial. Religious authorities and civic leaders frequently oppose theatrical performances as morally corrupting, and several colonies have banned them outright. The Continental Congress will recommend suspending theatrical entertainments during the Revolution as frivolous distractions from serious work. Yet theatre persists despite opposition, especially in cities like Philadelphia and New York, where audiences pay to see plays performed by professional acting companies. The tension between entertainment and moral improvement plays out across colonial culture, with different communities drawing the line in different places. Reading is entertainment for the literate minority. Newspapers circulate among coffeehouses and taverns, discussed and debated by groups of readers. Pamphlets on religious, political and practical topics find audiences. Novels are beginning to appear, though many moralists worry that fiction corrupts readers by encouraging fantasy and emotional excess. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac entertains while instructing, its witty proverbs providing both amusement and practical wisdom. The fundamental difference between colonial entertainment and modern entertainment is participation. You don't sit passively consuming content someone else produced. You sing the songs, dance the dances, bet on the fights, jeer at the punished. Entertainment is social, communal, embedded in relationships with neighbours and community. It requires presence, engagement, and usually some form of contribution. The isolation of modern entertainment, one person, one screen, no interaction required, would seem not only strange but sad to colonial Americans. You've heard there's news from Philadelphia, or maybe Boston, or wherever the latest dramatic development of the revolution happened. But hearing news and actually receiving news are different propositions in 1776, where communication moves at the speed of horses and ships, and the information that reaches you is already old by the time you process it. Consider the timeline. Something happens in Philadelphia. Let's say Congress makes an important declaration, though we're not thinking of any specific declaration in particular. A printer sets the news in type, runs copies, and distributes them locally. Riders carry copies to nearby towns. Ships carry copies to coastal cities. From those distribution points, word spreads further through post riders, travellers, and oral transmission. The news radiates outward from its source at perhaps 40 or 50 miles per day on good roads, slower over difficult terrain, and not at all across water until a ship arrives. If you live in rural Massachusetts, news from Philadelphia might take a week to reach you. If you live in Georgia, make that 3 weeks or more. If you live in London and want to know what's happening in your rebellious colonies, expect to wait 2 months at minimum. Atlantic crossings average 6 weeks, and that's assuming favourable winds and no mishaps. The world is large when information travels slowly, and events that feel urgent to participants feel historical to distant observers by the time word arrives. Newspapers exist but function differently than modern newspapers. They're typically 4 pages, printed once or twice weekly, filled with essays, letters, advertisements, and whatever news has trickled in since the last issue. There are no reporters in the modern sense, no trained journalists investigating stories. Editors compile information from correspondence, from other newspapers, from travellers' accounts, and present it with varying degrees of accuracy. Fake news, as a concept, would puzzle colonial readers, mainly because they never expected news to be reliably true in the first place. Everything is rumour until you hear it from multiple sources, and even then you maintain scepticism. Literacy limits newspaper readership, but information spreads beyond the literate through oral transmission. Someone reads the newspaper aloud at a tavern. The content gets discussed, summarised, and carried home to family members who can't read themselves. Sermons incorporate current events, ministers interpreting news through religious frameworks for congregations who get their worldview from church. The news doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's immediately processed, interpreted, and argued about by communities trying to understand events that affect their lives. Letters are the primary mode of personal communication for those who can write them. You compose a letter to a relative in Virginia, fold and seal it, and entrust it to the postal system, which exists, charging rates based on distance and number of pages, but is slow and not entirely reliable. Your letter might arrive in 2 weeks or 4, or never if the rider loses it, or the ship sinks, or any of the other disasters that befall communication in transit. Important news gets repeated in multiple letters sent by different routes, improving the odds that at least one copy arrives. The postal system itself is revolutionary infrastructure, though we take it for granted. Benjamin Franklin served as Joint Postmaster General for the colonies under British authority, improving routes and reducing delivery times. When he was dismissed for revolutionary sympathies, the Continental Congress appointed him to run a new American postal system. The existence of this communication network, imperfect as it is, allows coordination across vast distances. Without it, Organising revolution across 13 scattered colonies would be nearly impossible. Historians still argue about how well-informed ordinary colonists actually were about the major events of their time. Did farmers in the backcountry understand the political debates happening in coastal cities? Did they care? The evidence suggests wide variation. Some communities followed events closely, discussed them passionately, and formed strong opinions about independence, loyalty, and the proper course of action. Other communities remained focused on local concerns, the revolution a distant noise that mattered mainly when soldiers or tax collectors appeared. Here's a quirky detail. The phrase, "don't shoot the messenger," has particular resonance in revolutionary America. Post riders carry news between military forces, and the news they carry is sometimes unwelcome. The protection of messengers is an established principle, but in the heat of conflict principles sometimes fail. Riders are shot at, captured, and occasionally killed. The information they carry, troop movements, battle outcomes, diplomatic developments, is worth enough that both sides try to intercept enemy communications. The mail is not neutral, it's a strategic asset. You're standing with neighbours now, someone having brought a newspaper from the village, and you're listening as the literate member of your group reads aloud. The words come slowly. Reading aloud is a skill distinct from silent reading, but the content lands. Something has happened somewhere. It affects your future in ways you're trying to understand. You ask questions, offer opinions, argue about what it all means. This is how news worked in 1776. Collectively processed, communally interpreted, socially digested. The isolation of scrolling through headlines on your phone, alone with your reactions, would seem not only strange but dangerously atomizing to people who understood knowledge as inherently shared. The road stretches before you, though road might be a generous description. What you're travelling on is more accurately a track, two ruts worn into the earth by generations of wagon wheels, with varying degrees of maintenance depending on whose responsibility this particular stretch falls under. Travel in colonial America is slow, uncomfortable, and occasionally deadly, which is why most people do as little of it as possible. If you're walking, expect to cover perhaps 20 miles on a good day over decent terrain. That's assuming you start at dawn, push through until dusk, and don't encounter significant obstacles. Rivers without bridges must be forded, finding shallow crossing points and hoping the water doesn't rise above your knees. Mountains must be climbed on paths that often deserve the term goat trail, more than road. Swamps must be navigated, adding miles to any direct route. The landscape that will eventually become a highway system currently consists of the paths that animals and indigenous people wore into the terrain, sometimes widened and improved by colonists, more often left in whatever state nature and use have created. Horses speed things up, but not as dramatically as you might imagine. A horse can cover 30 to 40 miles per day at a sustainable pace, but that pace requires rest, feeding, and care that adds time and complexity. You must find lodging where horses can be stabled and fed, or carry provisions for an animal that eats significantly more than you do. Horses throw shoes on rough terrain, go lame from injuries, and occasionally decide that a particular river crossing or steep incline is simply beneath their dignity. The romantic image of galloping across the countryside is exactly that, romantic. Real travel on horseback is a walking pace with occasional trotting, hour after hour, jarring your spine and numbing your posterior. Stagecoaches exist for those who can afford them and travel on routes they service, but they are available only along major corridors between significant towns. A stagecoach is essentially a wooden box on wheels, suspended on leather straps that provide minimal cushioning against roads that are actively hostile to cushioning. You share this box with strangers, typically 6 to 9 passengers, crammed into a space designed for perhaps 4 comfortable humans. The experience is hot in summer, freezing in winter, dusty or muddy depending on conditions, and punctuated by accidents when wheels break, horses fail, or the coach overturns on a sharp turn. Roads themselves vary enormously in quality. In some colonies, road maintenance is a civic obligation assigned to local residents who must contribute labour several days per year to fill holes, clear debris, and perform basic upkeep. These statute labour systems produce mixed results, depending on how seriously residents take their obligations. Private turnpikes exist where investors build and maintain roads in exchange for toll revenue, but these are mostly in more developed areas and cover limited distances. The vast majority of colonial roads are simply there, created by use, maintained by nobody, and deteriorating constantly. Water travel offers advantages when it's available. Rivers and coastal waters carry goods and people far more efficiently than overland routes. A boat moving downstream can cover 50 miles or more in a day with minimal effort. Ocean voyages between colonial ports, Boston to Charleston for example, are faster than overland journeys despite the distances involved. But water travel requires access to navigable waterways, boats or ship passage, and cooperation from weather. Storms delay or destroy vessels. Rivers freeze in winter. The convenience is real but conditional. Historians still argue about how this limited mobility affected colonial society. Did geographic isolation create distinct regional cultures that would later struggle to unite as one nation? Did the difficulty of travel make local communities more self-sufficient and more suspicious of outsiders? Did the reliance on waterways concentrate development in coastal and riverine areas, while leaving the interior underdeveloped? The answers are probably yes to all of these, in varying degrees. Here's something that might surprise you. Travel could be genuinely dangerous. Bandits and highway robbers existed, targeting travellers who might carry money or valuables. Isolated roads offered opportunities for crime that populated areas didn't. Getting lost was easy when signage was rare and landmarks unfamiliar. Injuries sustained far from help could become fatal through infection or exposure. A broken leg on a remote road might kill you before help arrived. Travellers commonly made wills before long journeys, just in case. Lodging along travel routes means taverns and inns, which we've mentioned as entertainment venues, but which also serve as the colonial equivalent of hotels. You rent a bed, not a room, a bed, which you might share with a stranger if the inn is crowded. Privacy is not expected. Meals are included or purchased separately of variable quality. The experience ranges from tolerable to nightmarish, depending on the establishment and your luck. You're standing at a crossroads now, looking at a weathered signpost that might once have been legible. The road to the left leads toward the coast. The road to the right leads inland. Both look equally rutted, equally unwelcoming, equally likely to challenge your endurance. You choose and you begin walking because the alternative is staying here, and staying here accomplishes nothing. The journey will take as long as it takes. You will arrive when you arrive. This is travel in 1776, and impatience helps nothing. The smell hits you before the city itself comes into view. You've been approaching Philadelphia, or perhaps Boston or New York for hours, and the intensifying stench serves as reliable distance marker. The countryside smells of nature. Manure, certainly, but also trees, earth, growing things. The city smells of concentrated humanity in quantities that overwhelm any natural baseline. Welcome to urban colonial America, where everything you've experienced on the farm gets multiplied, compressed, and fermented in ways that defy modern comprehension. Philadelphia in 1776 is the largest city in British North America, home to perhaps 30,000 people. Boston and New York follow with populations around 15 to 20,000 each. Charleston, the major southern port, houses perhaps 12,000. These numbers sound tiny by modern standards. Suburbs contain more people. But remember that these populations occupy spaces without sewers, without garbage collection, without paved streets, without running water, without any of the infrastructure that makes modern urban life possible. 30,000 people generating waste, dumping waste, and living amid waste create conditions that would make modern health inspectors weep. Streets are unpaved and function as open sewers. Household waste, kitchen scraps, chamber pot contents, dead animals, everything gets thrown into the street to be handled by rain, scavenging animals, or eventual removal by whoever might be assigned that miserable job. Pigs roam freely in many cities, serving as living garbage processors who convert street waste into eventual pork. This sounds efficient until you consider what those pigs are eating, and what their presence adds to the street's already complex aromatic profile. Mud season, spring and fall primarily, transforms streets into knee-deep morasses that swallow shoes, cripple horses, and make any journey an adventure. Housing density in colonial cities creates fire risks that modern building codes exist specifically to prevent. Wooden structures stand wall to wall, their chimneys throwing sparks onto neighbouring roofs, their hearths burning constantly in spaces with inadequate ventilation. Great fires periodically sweep through colonial cities, destroying blocks or entire neighbourhoods in conflagrations that spread faster than bucket brigades can extinguish them. Fire insurance companies begin forming in the mid-18th century precisely because fire is not a rare catastrophe, but an expected periodic disaster. Disease flourishes in these conditions. Epidemics sweep through colonial cities with terrifying regularity. Smallpox kills thousands when it arrives in populations lacking immunity. Yellow fever appears in port cities, carried by ships from tropical regions, claiming lives in waves that empty streets and cripple commerce. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, the various ailments that thrive in unsanitary conditions, maintain constant low-level presence with occasional dramatic spikes. Wealthy residents flee to country estates when epidemics strike. The poor stay and die. Yet cities also offer advantages that draw people despite the dangers. Commerce concentrates in urban areas, the shops, the craftsmen, the professionals, the markets where goods and money change hands. Information flows more readily in cities where newspapers publish, coffee houses buzz with conversation, and travellers bring news from distant places. Entertainment, education, and culture cluster in urban centres. The wealthy maintain townhouses where they conduct business and socialise during the season, retreating to rural estates when city air becomes too foul or too dangerous. Social stratification is more visible in cities than in the countryside. The wealthy merchant lives in a brick townhouse with glass windows, multiple stories, servants, and furnishings imported from London. The labouring poor crowd into tenements and boarding houses, entire families occupying single rooms, sharing beds with strangers when economic necessity demands. The distance between rich and poor is measurable in city blocks. A walk from the finest neighbourhoods to the worst takes minutes, and the contrast is stark. Historians still argue about whether colonial cities were cauldrons of revolutionary sentiment or conservative bastions resisting change. The evidence points both ways. Urban artisans and mechanics formed organisations that would become politically active. Urban mobs rioted against British policies, tarring and feathering loyalists, destroying property of those deemed enemies of liberty. But urban merchants also had the most to lose from disrupted trade and often counselled moderation. Cities contained multitudes, politically as in every other way. Here's a quirky urban detail. Street lighting exists in a few colonial cities, but it's primitive and unreliable. Philadelphia pioneered street lamps under Franklin's influence, oil-burning fixtures that cast small circles of light at intervals along major thoroughfares. Boston and New York followed with their own systems. But these lights are dim by modern standards, require constant maintenance, and go out regularly. Urban nights remain dark and dangerous despite these efforts. You're walking through city streets now, stepping carefully to avoid the worst of the mud and waste, pressing against buildings when wagons pass, trying to remember which turns will lead you to your destination. The crowds jostle, more people in one block than in your entire rural township. The noise is constant, vendors hawking wares, wheels rattling on cobblestones where cobblestones exist, animals protesting, people arguing, children crying. The sensory overload would exhaust a modern tourist in hours. For residents, it's simply home. There's a topic we've been circling, mentioning in passing, that demands direct address. The prosperity of colonial America, the farms, the trade, the cities we've been exploring, rests on a foundation of enslaved labour. You cannot understand everyday life in 1776 without understanding that for hundreds of thousands of people, everyday life means bondage. Slavery exists in every colony in 1776. This might surprise you if your mental map of American slavery focuses exclusively on southern plantations. New England has slaves. The middle colonies have slaves. The proportion is smaller than in the South. Perhaps 2 to 3% of the population in New England versus 40% or more in South Carolina. But enslaved people are present everywhere, performing work in households, on farms, in skilled trades, and on the docks. The division between slave states and free states hasn't happened yet. That's a future development. Right now, slavery is national. For enslaved people, daily life differs fundamentally from everything else we've discussed. You don't wake in your own home because you cannot own a home. You don't eat what you choose because you eat what you're given. You don't work for family benefit because your labour belongs to someone else. The rhythms of the day, rising, working, eating, sleeping, are dictated by overseers and owners whose priorities determine your existence. The physical hardships we've described for free colonists are present for enslaved people, plus the additional burden of coerced labour, without compensation, family separation at owners' whims, and the constant threat of violence for any perceived disobedience. On southern plantations, enslaved people typically work in gangs under overseer supervision, performing the brutal labour of tobacco, rice, and cotton cultivation. The workday runs from dawn to dusk, sometimes longer during harvest. Physical punishment, whipping especially, enforces discipline. Clothing, food, and housing are minimal, provided not for comfort but to maintain workers' capacity for continued labour. Families form but can be destroyed at any moment through sale. Children are born into slavery, their bondage inherited through their mothers regardless of their father's status. The accumulation of wealth that plantations represent is built on this system of hereditary, racialized, uncompensated labour. In northern colonies, slavery often looks different in form while maintaining the same fundamental structure. Enslaved people might work as household servants, as skilled artisans alongside their owners, or as agricultural labourers on smaller farms. The relationships might seem more personal. The treatment might be less brutal on average, but the essential condition remains. These people are property. They can be bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, and worked at their owner's discretion. The intimacy of northern slavery, enslaved people living in closer proximity to enslaving families, creates its own forms of psychological oppression that shouldn't be mistaken for kindness. Resistance takes many forms. Enslaved people slow their work, break tools, feign illness, and otherwise sabotage the productivity their owners demand. Some run away, seeking freedom in cities where anonymity might protect them, or in communities of escaped slaves in frontier areas, or in British lines where promises of freedom attract runaways during the Revolutionary War. Some revolt violently, though such uprisings are rare and brutally suppressed. Most survive through accommodation, performing required labour while maintaining inner lives, family connections, and cultural practices that preserve humanity despite systems designed to deny it. Historians still argue about almost every aspect of colonial slavery, how it compared to slavery in the Caribbean or South America, how it evolved over time, how enslaved people experienced and resisted their conditions, and how it shaped both enslaved and enslaving populations. The debates continue because the sources are limited. Enslaved people rarely left written records, and the records made by enslavers present biased perspectives. But the broad outlines are clear. Slavery was central to colonial prosperity, present throughout the colonies, and devastating to those caught within it. Here's something that illuminates the era's moral complexity. Many leaders of the American Revolution owned slaves while proclaiming liberty as a fundamental right.